Coloradans are marching and organizing for social justice and for police reform in numbers unprecedented in recent memory. Mr. Hickenlooper, do you think that we should defund the police? If so, how? And if not defund the police, why not?
Well, I don't think we should defund the police, but I do believe we need to reform the police. When I first became mayor, I made some major efforts at police reform, but we didn't get far enough. And now we have to recognize that things like making sure police officers turn on their cameras, that they don't use stranglehold, these are essential parts of any reform effort. We also have to look beyond just police reform and make sure that we're getting equal opportunity in housing, in education, equal opportunity in jobs. We have to restructure a whole different way to think about this country and recognize this is a moment in time where people all over the country are rising up and really demanding that we live true to our values, that this is a country where everyone has equality under law.
Mr. Hickenlooper, thank you. Mr. Romanoff, the advocates say that reform simply does not do enough. Some of them want to take away resources to defund the police. What do you think?
Reform is not enough. We do need to shift resources and demilitarize the police. We need to invest in community services. John fundamentally misunderstands this moment, just as he misunderstood what Black Lives Matter means. Frankly, it doesn't do us much good to say Black Lives Matter when day after painful day we act as if they don't. Yes, we need independent oversight bodies to hold police officers accountable. Yes, we need body cameras and an end to the brutal practices of chokeholds and strangleholds. But as long as we continue to treat incarceration as the solution to every problem, we will not get the equality that we deserve. John brought in the author of the broken windows theory, which is responsible in part for this era of mass incarceration. We need a new approach, and that's why I stand with the protesters in their effort to turn America into a source of equality and end the oppression that has persisted for generations and centuries.
Mr. Hickenlooper, I want to give you the opportunity to respond, specifically to the idea that when you were recently asked what Black Lives Matters means to you, you inserted the phrase, all lives matter. Do you understand why that was offensive to some people?
Yes, of course, and I stepped on my own words. Black Lives Matter. And George Floyd and Paul Childs, the 15-year-old African-American boy who was shot in his front hall by a Denver police officer as I was being, 2 weeks before I was being sworn in, you know, they've been held to a different system of justice for far too long. And when I was mayor, we began major police reform in partnership with the Ministerial Alliance, who's endorsed me in this campaign. But we have so much farther to go. And I think what we're seeing now and looking at moving resources to let kids have diversion programs and not putting them in jail, that's just the first step. We've got a long way to go.
All right, Mr. Hickenlooper, thank you. I want to continue this conversation with a question from my colleague, 9 News political reporter Marshall Zellinger.
Both of you talk about police reform, social justice, and racial equality. Tell me specifically, what did you do when you were in a position of elected power and had the ability not just to talk about change, but make it happen? Mr. Romanoff, I'll start with you.
You bet. So I joined my colleagues in the legislature in increasing funding for civil rights enforcement. I recognize that putting civil rights laws on the books is not enough unless we actually implement those laws. I had a chance to make a headway on this issue before I ever served in public office. When I turned 21, I moved to Montgomery, Alabama, to join the Southern Poverty Law Center in its fight against the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazi groups. I did not expect to be having the same fight 30 years later, or to find a president of the United States on the other side. I also designed and supervised an undercover investigation of employment discrimination on behalf of a state civil rights agency. So I understand deeply that the discrimination, the segregation, the vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow have subjected African Americans to outright inequality since well before our country's founding. And it is not enough for us to declare victory at this point until we act on these words that Black Lives Matter.
Mr. Hickenlooper, you've twice now brought up some of your reforms when you were the mayor of Denver. if I could ask you to answer Marshall's question about what you did in elected office, based on your 2 terms as governor, were you able to move the needle on police reform or racial justice there?
Let me give a couple specifics first about while I was mayor and working with the Black Ministerial Alliance. This is 10 years before Ferguson. We created an Office of the Independent Monitor with the subpoena power to make sure that any allegation of police brutality got investigated thoroughly, created a civilian oversight commission so neighborhoods could have a voice in how their community was policed. We hired minority recruiters. We made sure every police officer had to do crisis intervention training so that they understood not to escalate situations. Now, as governor, we focused more on judicial reform and making sure that prisoners got training and job skills and hopefully had jobs waiting before we put them back into the community. We essentially completely ended administrative segregation, the solitary confinement that took so many of the prisoners who have mental health issues and locked them up and in many cases exaggerated their mental issues dramatically. These are some of the most fundamental things that you can do. We also made sure that we made it very difficult to try teenagers as adults for crimes they commit.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hickenlooper. So looking for some quick answers here on this same issue. These are yes or no questions. Would invite you to answer them, yes or no. Colorado State Legislature appears ready to strip law enforcement officers of qualified immunity so that they can be held personally liable for misconduct. I'm going to ask each of you in turn if you would support a bill in the U.S. Senate to remove qualified immunity for every law enforcement officer in America. Mr. Hickenlooper?
Yes, as described in Colorado.
All right. Mr. Romanoff?
Yes.
I want to ask you each if you believe that the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis was a murder. Mr. Romanoff?
Yes.
Mr. Hickenlooper?
Yes.
Mr. Hickenlooper, do you think that Marvin Booker's death while you were the mayor at the hands of Denver jail deputies was a murder as well?
It was egregious neglect, and I think falls into that category of murder.
As such, do you think that prosecutors, District Attorney Beth McCann or the Attorney General at the state level should reopen the investigation into Martin Booker's death while you were mayor?
Well, they've gone through that process thoroughly. At a certain point, I'm not sure it's going to return benefit to either the family or the community.
All right. And just quickly, Mr. Romanoff, do you believe that Martin Booker's death in Denver was a murder?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Romanoff, you have called for reparations to be paid for centuries of injustice to African Americans. You campaigned last week with former presidential candidate Marianne Williamson, who has suggested that $500 billion in reparations would be just. What do you think is a fair number for reparations and a fair process?
I think that's a fair starting point. Look, this crime against humanity, the crime of slavery and centuries of segregation and discrimination that have followed, needs to be remedied. We can't simply declare victory since we have abolished slavery or ended, at least on paper, segregation by law. We also ought to recognize, in my view, that America's other original sin persists as well. The genocide of the Native American population on this continent continues to ripple through so many communities, our tribal communities, who are subjected to unequal conditions to this day. So I think a conversation about reparations needs to lead to action, not just a discussion, but action on both fronts.